It's good to see you all here. Appreciate you being here. Especially appreciate our visitors. Like I said, we are missing a lot of people. We got one guy back. I kind of recognize him. I'm not sure. I think it's Mark. I'm assuming that Judy's not feeling well this morning. Okay, I kind of that's a long drive back. I suspect she might be feeling some of the effects of that. So we'll be praying for her. David just texted. David and Jan are out of town. In fact, I guess they just got done with worship. He said they're going to a Rangers game this afternoon. So we're glad to have you here who are here. If you haven't filled out a visitor's card, you're welcome. Please do that. We'd love to get to know you better. We are having, as I mentioned, as was mentioned earlier, our second Sunday singing at our house afterwards. What we typically do is we'll pick up lunch wherever you want, bring it over to the house. We eat together, and then usually around probably 1:30 or so, we'll start singing. We'll sing for about an hour, hour and a half, or however long we decide to do it. And so everyone, of course, visitor or member is welcome to that as well. Just see us afterwards. We'll give you all the information you need. So we appreciate you being here. And with that in mind, we'll go ahead and start in Exodus chapter 20. If you want to go over there and put your bookmark there, we will at least spend a little bit of time there. I want to go back to a series I told you I wanted to start last month, and I gave a kind of introduction to the Ten Commandments, and we talked about a few things related to the commandments as a whole. And now I want to start going in and looking at the specific individual commands. And if you remember, as we talked about this, these ideas of God's 10 commandments or God's 10 words, as is the literal translation, the idea that these were given as part of the law of Moses to really, in a lot of ways, give a picture of what God expects from his people. And as we talked about, while the law of Moses has been taken out of the way, we're not under that law today. At the same time, what we see is 10 words or 10 commands that give us the essence of what God has really always wanted from his people. And in fact, while again, we are not necessarily under the law, I always get raised eyebrows when I say, well, we're not under the 10 commandments today. But we can see all of them with at least some degree being carried forth and being shown us in the new covenant in Christ, and certainly no more than the one we're going to talk about today, which is the idea of the first commandment: you will have no other gods before me. And if you remember, just as a quick review, we made 2 points that there are a couple of things about the commandments in general that are important to bring in mind. First of all, that the Ten Commandments are built on two foundational principles that are not specifically included in the Ten Commandments. And of course, the greatest commandment is Jesus quotes, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind, all thy strength." I don't know if I got that in the right order. But the idea is that that is a fundamental principle that is not included, but it undergirds everything that we read in this passage. And he says the second is likened to it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And if you remember, we talked about how really you have the first four commandments that are focused on looking at God and that relationship, and then you have the last six that are focused on looking at each other and our relationships in relation to God. And it tells us right at the beginning that what we see in God's law is a top down structure. In other words, your first focus is those four commands: the idea of seeing God and looking at God and honoring God as God. And in doing so, that then impacts how you look at each other and how you work together and how you view each other as members of God's kingdom together. And I think we see that exemplified in a lot of ways, very specifically in this first commandment, because as the first four inform the last six, this first one really is the focus of all of this and how the commandments are played out throughout this. And if you read in verse 2, God introduces the commandments by saying, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." And while verse 3 is that the actual command, I think we can kind of group those two verses together a little bit because not only is God delivering the first commandment, but he's laying the foundation, the basis for all of this, because he tells us three things in this passage. He says, first of all, this is who God is. This is who I am. In fact, very literally, I am. The word Lord here that is used, it's used throughout the Bible, as you notice. And there's a lot of different words that are translated Lord. Your translation here may have the Lord in all capitals here. And that's indicating that the word that is being used here is the Hebrew word for Jehovah, Yahweh, God. This is the personal covenant name of God. God is introducing himself to his people now by name. If you remember back in Exodus 3, if you want to flip back over there, this is when Moses is first introduced to God, and God sends him back to his people and says, I'm going to send you as my messenger before them to bring them out of bondage. And Moses asks him in verse 13, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, say to the people of this Israel, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say to this people of the Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And thus I am to be remembered through all generations. God reintroduces himself by calling himself I am. And it's interesting that without getting into the Hebrew, which I can't speak, but I can read a little bit of people who do speak Hebrew. And the point here is that the word I am, the phrase I am, is actually closely related to what we read here, the word Jehovah or Yahweh. They're essentially the same, the root of the same word. The idea of God as one who is existent without explanation, without cause, without origin. He exists because he exists. He is because he is God. He is without beginning or without end. In Psalm chapter 90 and verse 1, the psalmist writes about God. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. In verse 4, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as not as a watch in the night. And that's how God introduces himself. I am. And in this covenant, this is how you will see me. This is how you will refer to me. And the name itself, as I said, is equivalent basically to the phrase to be. This is how you're going to see me as God. This is who I am. In Exodus 6, in verse 2, it says that God spoke to Moses and said, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob as God Almighty, as El Shaddai, as the word is in Hebrew. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. Apparently, it's kind of confusing if you get really curious about this and go to your, if you have an online Bible or a Bible in your app and you click on it, what you will see is the word Yahweh is actually used throughout the book of Genesis. This is not the first time we use this word, but what probably is happening is that Moses, in writing these in retrospect, is using the name of God before it has ever been used. Abraham apparently did not know this name. Isaac, Jacob did not know this name. At least that's what it appears. But now, in this covenant, this is who I am. This is how you are going to see me. And it's interesting, by the way, that, and I think I alluded to this last time we talked, but that when he says, I am the Lord your God, the word your there is singular. In other words, I'm your God. I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, I am the God of Jacob, and I am the God of Moses, and I am the God of Aaron, and I'm the God of you and you and you and everyone that's here. A personal relationship with you. And the same blessings that I gave to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I am now offering to each one of you if you will be in this covenant with me. He says, first of all, this is who God is. Second of all, he tells us what God has done for you. He sets this up by reminding Israel of what he had done. He brought you out of the land of Egypt. In essence, this is the God who gave birth to this nation, who gave life to this nation, and who redeemed this nation. Think about the scene in the mountain as all this is going on back in Exodus 19, the chapter before this, when God has told Moses, prepare the people because they are about to meet me. They are going to see and talk to the Lord. In verse 9 of chapter 19, it says, the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever. And Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. What an amazing, you need to be ready for this because this is going to be something you've never experienced before. And in verse 16, it says, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountains and a very loud trumpet blast so that all the people in the camp trembled. This is not a joyous, happy, pleasant experience, at least not for the people in their view. This is something that would have been terrifying. The only thing I can think, imagine standing in front of a giant mountain and watching as the volcanic eruption takes place and the ground shakes underneath you and the earth is splitting and all these things are happening. My instinct is going to be to get away from that mountain. This is not a pleasant experience at all. You can imagine how they're feeling when they're viewing all this. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. In Deuteronomy 5, when Moses is relating his conversation with God after this experience, he says in verse 28 of chapter 5 that the Lord heard your words when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. When they said, look, Moses, you talk to God. This is too much for us. We don't want to be a part of this. It's too scary. We're afraid we're all going to die. So you go speak to God for our part. We'll stay down here. And God says they're right in all that they've spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always to fear me and keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants forever. The fear of God is healthy when coupled with the knowledge that all God does is for your good. I think that's the point of what he's saying here. I'm the Lord. I'm not the Lord that's here to destroy you. I'm the Lord that has redeemed you. I'm the Lord that has done all of these things for you. As Deuteronomy 6:24 says that the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God for your good always, or for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are to this day. The fear should not be a dread. The fear should not be something that seeks to escape from the presence of God. It's a fear that arises from witnessing something that is not intended for our harm. God reassures his people that the safest place you can be is in the presence of God. Because you've seen the Lord, you've seen his power, all that he is and all that he can do, and you're rightly afraid of him. But this God says that I have called you here to bless you and to do good for you. And it's in this context that God delivers that first command. You shall have no other gods before me. Now we read what God expects from you, who he is, what he has done, and this is how I am to be received in his covenant. This is how you will treat God as holy because of who he is and because of what he has done. It's interesting. I've read this passage a lot, and I suspect all of us have. And typically, we will read this and say what he is saying is we need to put God first. And that's absolutely true. We need to put God first. I'll sometimes talk about that in this language, in this lesson. But there's more going on here than just that. Because the phrase that's translated before me isn't necessarily referring to an order of preference. In fact, later on in this passage, in Exodus 20, verse 20, he uses the same idea. It says in verse 20, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The passage, the word is used 13 times in the Old Testament. And it always refers to this idea of being in someone's presence. It literally means front or head or face. The idea when something is before me, it is in front of me, it's in my view. Jeremiah 6, verse 7 describes how God saw the corruption of Jerusalem during that day. He said that violence and destruction are heard within her, sickness and wounds are ever before me. In other words, I always see what you're doing. I always see the horrors and the sins and the corruptions that's going on. I can't look away from it. It's not hidden from my sight. And I think that's the idea here. That God is calling Israel when he says, no gods before me. What he is saying is, I don't want you to have gods in my presence. Don't have them here at all. This isn't about me being first and them being second. Even if it's a distant second, he says, they don't belong here at all. There's no place for these gods in this covenant relationship. You will not bring them into my presence. You will leave them behind. So what we learn immediately from this passage and this idea and this command is that God is first and foremost a jealous God. In fact, he even used that phrase in the next command. Well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but we'll get to this passage later. In Exodus 20, verse 5, when he's talking about false gods and idols and making graven images, and he says, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Exodus 34, verse 14, in fact, says the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. His name literally is jealous. And that seems like an odd thing for us to say, doesn't it? Because we don't ever think jealousy is a good quality, do we? In fact, the Bible talks about it a lot of times as being negative. We're always telling people, don't be jealous. No, you shouldn't be jealous. Jealousy is a bad thing. It's corruption. It's corrupting. It eats away at you. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 2, when Paul's talking about the Corinthians being carnally minded, worldly minded, what does he tell them? He says in verse 3, you are still of the flesh, for while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh, behaving in a human way? So jealousy is a human thing. Jealousy is corrupt. Jealousy is selfishness. It's evil. It's fleshly. It's one of those things you're not supposed to be anymore when you come to Christ. And yet, we see that God is a jealous God. So what is it? Are we supposed to be like God? Is jealousy right or is it wrong? Or does that make God a petty and self-centered being, just like human beings? I've heard a lot of people, especially atheists, who will make this argument. Look, see, you're God. He even admits it. He's jealous. He's just jealous. He wants something that he can't have, and it makes him angry and petty, and that's why he does all these things. That's sometimes how we see that. And from a human standpoint, that sometimes is what jealousy often causes us to do. But when you start to look at how, I'm sorry, I didn't click that one. As you start to look at how jealousy is used in Scripture, it's a lot like how we talk about anger, because it's not so much about the emotion itself. It is an emotional response. It's not so much the good or evil in the response. The evil or the good stems from how that emotion moves someone to act and how it causes me to feel about somebody else. Because when the Bible talks about jealousy in a negative way, is invariably referring to a reaction that demands something that is not mine to demand. It's simply me responding to something that somebody else says or has or does, and I want that, and it makes me angry when I'm not receiving it. A great example of this is over in Acts chapter 13, when Paul is speaking to the Jews in the city, and he's gone to the Sabbath, and the synagogue, and they've asked him to come back on the next Sabbath. And it says in verse 44 of Acts 13 that the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. We're angry that people are listening to Paul and not to us, because Paul talks about because we want that attention that he's getting. We want to be the authority, and Paul is now threatening that. It's making us angry. There's a little bit of an irony here, because Paul talks in a number of occasions about his desire to do exactly that, to provoke the Jews to jealousy. But it's a very different kind of jealousy, isn't it? Because if you remember in Romans 11, we're working through Romans as well. We'll get to chapter 11 at some point, so I may repeat myself here later. But in Romans 11, verse 13, Paul's talking about how God has used the Jews to bring the Gentiles into a covenant relationship with him. And he says in verse 13 that I'm speaking to you, Gentiles, inasmuch then as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. Paul's saying, I actually want them to be jealous. I want them to look at what God is doing from the Gentiles and saying, I want that. Why am I not getting that? But it's a relationship that they don't have right now. They're on the outside. You don't have the right to expect this or to demand this, but you ought to want it. You ought to recognize it's something you don't have, and it ought to motivate you. The godly response to jealousy in this case is to do what? How can I do that? Not to their exclusion. We want to be God's chosen people and leave the Gentiles out of this. No, I want to be part of that. I want to be included. The ungodly response, of course, is what we saw in Acts 13, which is no, no, no. We want things the way it was. I want it all to myself. I want something that is not mine, and I'm not entitled that I'm not entitled to, and I'm going to be angry and disruptive for anyone who stands in my way. Jealousy is sinful because when I become angry that someone has something that I'm not entitled to, it can it can be a very powerful tool for repentance too, if I'll allow it to. When I'm outside of the body of Christ and I see the fellowship that we have with one another here, someone sees that and the love that is shared, and they say, I want that too. And I'm motivated to ask, how can I have it? Not to your exclusion, but to share it with you. That's what jealousy is supposed to do. That's a right application of jealousy. Now, God's jealousy works a little bit differently than that. God is a jealous God, not in that he is provoked to share in something that someone else has, but in that he expects what is his by right. Paul uses that same language in 2 Corinthians 11 when he talks about the relationship that he is trying to establish. He says in verse 1 of chapter 11, "For I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." The idea that I'm jealous of you because this is where you belong, and I'm worried that you're going to go somewhere where you don't belong. And you're going to share in a fellowship with someone that you have no business sharing fellowship with because you're not in a covenant with them. You're in a covenant with God. You're in a covenant with Christ. That's why the great comparison here is the relationship between the husband and the wife. It's intended very clearly. 1 Corinthians 11 shows us that the husband and wife relationship is supposed to teach us about our relationship to God. Is there jealousy in that? Is it wrong for a husband or a wife to be jealous of their spouse? Well, depends, doesn't it? Is the wife or the husband giving an attention to someone that is due to their spouse? Same thing, husband and wife. It's the same thing. If I'm giving something that ought to be given to somebody else, yeah, I'm going to be jealous of that. I'm not going to be happy about that, and I may act accordingly. But as I was thinking about that, this idea that we have jealousy. And I think the reason that we're told that sometimes jealousy is a good thing is because jealousy reminds us that in a covenant relationship, there are obligations. Something that I owe this person that are unique to that covenant. They're not shared outside the covenant. And it's not because that other person deserves this. It's not something because they've earned it. It's not something because they're better than somebody else. I'm gonna give this to you because you're just the best person in the world. That's not what it is. I may be the worst person in the world. The idea, though, is that this is the covenant, and this is what this person is owed, and this is what this person, in fact, owes me. And when we go outside that, that's going to be a problem. And that's kind of how our relationship with God is. The difference being that when God is jealous, when I take my attention and go someplace else, it's not because, well, I want you have something that I want. It's because you're going somewhere where you do not belong. And now it is because God deserves it. Because not only does God have that expectation due to the covenant, but God has that expectation because He is God and He has that right. He is our creator. And He has the right to be a jealous God. That's when the world wants to look at this and talk about, well, God just admits He's jealous. Well, yeah, He is because He's God. He created us. He made us with a purpose and He calls us to fulfill that purpose. And when we refuse to do that, we're in violation of everything that God has created us to do. But I don't think that that's the only consideration here. It's not just about jealousy. Is God jealous only in regard to His own glory? The idea that God has the right to my love, to my attention, and that if I don't do it, I'm somehow cheating Him. Well, that's part of it. But there's another part here because, as we've already alluded to this, everything that God calls us to do is why it's intended for your good always. Every bit of God's law, even every one of God's commandments, is intended to be a blessing to the people who follow them. In Psalm 19, if you remember in Psalm 19:10, the song that we sing so often, it says, "More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward." Paul talks about that in Romans. He talks about the law and its nature, and he says the law is good and righteous. And by implication, from that, is that God's jealousy and wanting our undivided attention is also for our good. And if we think that sounds odd, maybe we think about our relationships with our kids. I don't have kids. Laura has kids. I think just about everybody else here has kids at some point. And we think about our relationship to them. Who do we want them to listen to? Me or their teacher? The guy at the gas station? The random person they meet, their friends, do I want them listening to those people? Do I want them going to them for advice? Absolutely not. Why? Because I'm selfish? Because I'm narcissistic? Because I have to have the attention? No. It's because I have their best interest at heart. And I'm the only one that has their best interest at heart. When a child comes home and says, you know what, my teacher says that I may actually be a girl because I wear a pink shirt and I don't like to play football. I'm going to say, well, okay. I'm going to say, no, you don't listen to that person because that person does not have your best interest. She is trying to inculcate her worldview in your mind, and her concern is doing that. Her concern is not your relationship to God. Concern is not your spiritual well-being. And when we see our kids and we tell them, look, just because your friends tell you to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. Doesn't mean you should do it. Why do we do that? Is it because we're starved for attention? Because we want to feel important? Or is it because ultimately we know that no one in the world has a vested interest more so in keeping them safe, keeping them healthy, keeping them holy before God than the parent does? Don't we see that's exactly the same thing that God does? It's exactly why God wants us to be devoted to Him and to see Him to the exclusion of not just as one and 1A, not one and B, or A and B, not and C, but A, period. That's it. Nobody else, nothing else. In Ezekiel 34, uh, God is talking to Ezekiel about the failings of Israel's leaders, how they have led the flock astray, they have used the flock for their own gain, they have led selfishly and unrighteously. And in Ezekiel 34, verse 22, God talks about the time that I will change all of that. He says in verse 22, I will rescue my flock. They shall be no longer prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep, and I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. Of course, we know who he's talking about there. He's talking about the time when I will give you a better shepherd. I will give you the good shepherd. I'll bring Jesus to this world. I will enthrone him as king. He will be your leader, and he will do all these things. Why? Because he will be the one that will not exploit you. He will be the one that will lead you beside still waters and restore your soul and do all the things that Psalm 23 tells us that he will do. You see, that's how God sees us when we're following those wrong influences, when we're devoting to the wrong things, when we exalt worldly people and worldly influences and pursuits in the presence of what ought to be holy. We're sheep without a shepherd. That's what we look like. And even worse, we're sheep under a shepherd who is actively seeking our death. So God continually calls his people to keep their eyes focused on him, on his laws. That's why God says, you will have no other gods before me. No other gods besides me, no other gods in my presence, because they not only are they an affront to God's holiness, but because they're going to lead you into the destruction of your lives and of your souls. And ultimately, as we mentioned earlier, this one concept, is going to impact every other aspect of our lives. We talked about this, how the first 4 commandments inform the last 6, and how we view God will determine how we view each other. And that point, I think, can really be made in this one command. Our decision to put away all other idols and devote our worship to God is going to determine how fully I will buy into every one of these other 9 commandments. Isn't that true? And isn't that true of every other thing that we read, every other command that God gives us? If I don't put God first, why would I have an issue with taking the life of someone who's made in God's image? Because there will always be a greater good that says, well, I can be justified in doing this. I don't want to steal away from when I talked about thou shalt not kill, but I guess that's going to be in about 4 months, so I can maybe dip into it a little bit. But when I believe that I have the right to abort my child because of personal issues, I have the right to take a human life, and it is a human life. Because there are some things that are more important than honoring God and honoring those that are made in God's image. My anger, my vindication in saying I can take this person's life, I'm going to render evil for evil. Maybe it's not killing, maybe it's hating. But my own anger and vindication becomes my God. My own convenience and ease of life becomes my God in place of God. If I don't put God first, why would I honor my marriage vows? Because the covenant has no meaning. If I'm also honoring self, I have 2 covenants. I have a covenant with God, and I also have a covenant with self, and self wants to go do this. Self wants to violate that covenant and do what he wants to do. Which one is more important? Ultimately, eventually, self is going to win. And we see that tragically every day, even in the Lord's church, because we're not honoring God. And we don't see our covenant relationship with our spouse as a covenant relationship with God. If I don't put God first, why wouldn't I be willing to steal from someone else? Because after all, they've got stuff and I've got stuff and I need stuff, and what right do they have to it? The only reason they have it is because they just happen to go out and get it first. But if I want it and I need it more than them, isn't that more important? Doesn't that outweigh anything else? When I don't see what they have as something that is given to them by God, then why shouldn't I be able to take it? My self-importance, the fact that I am more important than you, I need it more than you, I'm gonna go take it. My self-importance becomes my God. I become my God, don't I? If I don't put God first, why would dishonesty be an issue? God is a God of truth. Everything about God, God is truth. He is the ultimate expression of truth. I can't have truth without God. Because if I don't have God, everything else is based on a lie, right? I'm going to believe that this world just happened to pop out of nowhere with no explanation, no higher authority, no design, no purpose, no anything. And if that's the case, truth is pretty much whatever I want it to be at that point. And so truth has really no value. And if my lie serves the God of self more effectively than telling the truth, why would I tell the truth? There was a stunning interview. I saw a clip of it from an NPR executive who literally said this. I wish I should have got it so I could quote it word for word. She said that, you know what? Sometimes the truth gets in the way of getting things done. This is an NPR executive. This is somebody whose job ostensibly is to report the news, to tell us what happened. And she's saying, look, sometimes the truth kind of gets in the way of what we really want to do. But isn't that true? A lot of times when truth is hard and truth has consequences that I don't want to bear, and a lot of times truth may cause things to be worse than they are. Things are a lot smoother if I can just tell a lie here. And if that's the important thing, my tongue, my version of reality, that becomes my God. If I don't put God first, why shouldn't I want more than God has given me? I think it's interesting. This last covenant command, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but it's interesting to me that this last command kind of circles us back to that first one. Because covetousness is really essentially what? Wanting more than I have, right? Wanting what I don't have to the point that I want what I am not entitled to have, what has not been given to me. And it assumes that I ought to be able to go and take it by my own wisdom and my own ability and my own strength. God says there will be no other gods in my presence. I will not share your devotion with anything or anyone else. But I say that's not enough for me because get this God promises to do all this for me. Why did Israel keep falling into idolatry? Because they weren't satisfied with what God had given them. They wanted what the other nations had. They didn't want to be different. They wanted the kind of worship and sensuality and lavish wealth that the people around them had. And if I only honor God, I'm not going to get any of that. I may never have it because God he's either said I can't have it, or he said he has not promised it to me, or he has not provided me with a pathway to obtain it. And so what does Israel go do? We just been in the divide. We've been in the divided kingdom class on Wednesday nights. And we know exactly what they did. They made room for other gods. We worship God, but we also secretly worship the other gods in the high place, offering sacrifices to Baal or Molech or one of the other gods of the Canaanites. And eventually it got so bad that they don't even try to hide it anymore. We just do it out in the open. Remember the story of Ahaz, who was so bold and brazen about it that he literally shuts the door of the temple of God and offers sacrifices to false gods right out in front of it in view of everyone. Interesting how that grows. Because false gods are never content to take just a little bit of our attention. That's the secret of all of this. They always demand more. And the reason for that is that they promise more than they can ever deliver. Ultimately, they always fall short for whatever reason. Because the people's answer to idolatry, when they would go into idolatry and they would either be taken into captivity or they would be punished or their cities would be destroyed or their crops would fail or whatever it might be, the answer always ends up being we just need to worship more gods. Or maybe we need to worship them harder and be more, we just double down on what we're trying to accomplish. And we ignore the voice of God that's calling us back through the prophets, trying to tell us that these tribulations and hardships are meant to turn you back to me. If you'll just come back to me, I'll take care of all those things just like I promised to do. And the answer is no. We're going to pursue these other gods. I think we used this verse a few weeks ago, Jeremiah 2. It's one of my favorite passages in Jeremiah. In verse 4, where it says, "Hear the words of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the clans of the house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, what wrong did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me and went after worthlessness and became worthless?" I love that. You become what you pursue. If you spend all your time pursuing things that don't matter, then your life is going to be a life with no consequence, of no value, because you're wasting it on something that doesn't matter, that has no worth. He says down in verse 7, "I brought you into plentiful land to enjoy its fruit and its good things. I've given you all these things. But when you came in, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. The priests did not say, 'Where is the Lord?' Those who handled the law did not know me. The shepherds transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and went after things that do not profit." And so they continually turned to idolatry because God had not given them everything that they wanted. God had not given them the things that they wanted. They wanted what they shouldn't have. And they turned away from God. And as a result of that, God revealed his wrath as a jealous God. Well, it's a good thing we don't have idolatry today, right? That we don't have to worry about that anymore. It's not applicable to us. We don't have golden altars that we bow down to. Nobody worships Molech anymore that I know of. I sometimes wonder maybe that's coming back at some point. We don't know, but and I will say that idolatry in terms of paganism and pagan worship is actually making a comeback. Maybe we're going to come. We may come full circle. Now, Lord willing, I won't be around long enough to see the day when Molech becomes the god of the United States of America. But let's not kid ourselves that that couldn't happen. Because the reality is that when we don't bow down to idols, just because we don't have an image that we bow down to and worship and offer sacrifices to, the fact is that we have idols. We have all kinds of idols in our lives. We don't just always form statues. We allow people and ideas and experiences, wealth, pleasure, all of these things to take their place in our lives to the extent that they begin to impinge on the covenant that God has given us, to take what God has given us, what robbing God of what he rightly deserves in our lives and what he has called us to do for our good always. Um, I stole a lot of this series, I met Don Truex. I've met him before, but I talked to him, and I told him I'm going to steal from you mercilessly. And he said, "Go ahead." So this is fine. But he quoted a passage in one of his lessons that he didn't say who it was from, and I couldn't find out who it was from. So I'm just going to quote it to somebody. But I think this point is good. The only true freedom a man has is the freedom to choose his gods. After that, his gods are going to determine what he's going to be. Isn't that true? The implication of this, the implication of all this that we've been talking about is that we have to make a choice and that we can make a choice. I get to choose who rules in my heart, don't you? We all get to. Nobody can force themselves into our lives. Nobody can cause themselves to be the ruler over our hearts. We have almost no control. We're getting into a presidential cycle. You realize how little control any of us in this room have over any of that? Who's going to get elected? Who's not going to get elected? We're all going to go vote, but it's not going to really do a whole lot of difference in the grand scheme of things. It's not going to change much. We can barely control who runs this city, to be honest with you. But you know what I do control? I control who's ruling in my heart, because nobody's ruling over my heart unless I allow it, unless I invite them in to take that seat and to take that prominence in my life. But once that happens, once that truly happens, all the other decisions of my life have a way of being made for me, even if it doesn't seem that way. Because if I put wealth on the throne of my heart, every decision I make will ultimately depend on whether it lines up with that goal. If I put pleasure on that throne, anyone who wants a substantial piece of my attention is going to have to consult with pleasure first. Is it going to be fun? Am I going to enjoy it? It's going to be too hard. I'm not going to do that. And the longer anyone sits on that throne, the more entrenched it becomes. It's just like the idols of the Old Testament. Those idols today make always claim more and more of our time because they provide less and less of what they say they can do for us, what they promise to bring for us, or what we expect to get out of them. And so we keep giving more and more of our time, more of our energy, more of our hearts until we look back one day and we realize that my entire life is now consumed and revolves around this thing that has nothing to do with God. And everything else in my life has now become an accommodation for that, or it will be turned away. God warned us about that, didn't he? What does Jesus say in Matthew 6:21? For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The reverse of that's kind of true, isn't it? I suspect it's kind of a parallel statement rather than an if-then statement, because when you think about it, the thing I consider to be treasure are the things that are sitting on the throne of my heart. Where my heart is, there my treasure will be too. What I want, that's what I'm going to store up. That's what I'm going to put my effort into. My actions ultimately are always going to be a reflection of what matters most to me. And we can kid ourselves and say that's not true, but it is. Isaiah writes in Isaiah chapter 44 of the foolishness of building your own God. It's one of my favorite passages. It's just, and we can read it and we almost get a good laugh. It's almost comedy. He writes in verse 12 of Isaiah 44, the ironsmith takes a cutting tool and works it over the coals. He fashions it with hammers and works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and is faint. The carpenter stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into a figure of a man with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. He cuts down cedars, or he chooses a cypress tree or an oak, and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar, and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread, and he also makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. Also he warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm. I've seen the fire." And the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to worship it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." And we think, how foolish is that? How stupid could anybody be that they would do something like this? And yet, how often does our worship to God, our service to God, take a back seat to serving the things that we have made ourselves? Maybe we didn't go out into the forest and cut it down and shape it into some sort of an idol. But our homes, our jobs, our possessions, our entertainment, the things that we can accomplish through our own time and resources and effort, valuing those things above that which God offers us, that when we choose to serve Him, we put God on the throne. But are we bringing idols into His presence as well? Because God offers what the idols of this world cannot give us, fulfilling a need that will never be satisfied apart from God. And the only way we're ever going to see that is if we stop serving these other things and we start focusing on God. The God who says, "Put no other gods before me because I am a jealous God," also tells us that if you refuse to do that, you're robbing yourself of the truly good things in life, things that are eternal, things that are true value. This isn't God saying, "I don't want you to have any fun." This isn't God saying, I don't want you to I don't want you to treat your family with respect. I don't want you to have money. I don't want you to have success." That's not what any of this is about. The point is that if that's what you care about, you're really missing the whole point of life. Isaiah 55, he gives us the flip side of this. Having condemned Israel for their pursuit of idolatry, he gives this invitation from God in verse 1 when he says, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the water, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy milk, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourself in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David." God warns us that because God wants and expects to be seated on that throne, there's something you need to do, but there's something you're missing out if He's not sitting on it. Because only God is the King who's truly worthy of that honor to rule over us, because He's the only one that knows what's best for us. He's the only one that seeks our interest. God wants to be enthroned in our hearts so much that he sent his son to this world to live as a man, to die as a man, and to be raised up, to show us that unlike these other gods who could do nothing for us beyond the grave, this God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a living God who offers true life and every good gift for those who seek him, if they're willing to put him on the throne and put everything else away. How do we do that? Three real, and I really do mean this, three short things, actually four short things. And I borrowed three of these from Don, but I've got one at the end that I kind of thought about as well. How do I ensure that Christ is on my throne? That's easier said than done, isn't it? Well, the first thing I think that we do is that here's one idea: give God first of all the first words of the day. That's a pretty good idea. Who do I talk to when I wake up? Who is on my mind when I wake up in the morning? Well, Laura's right there. Of course, she's usually asleep beforehand, but who do I want to talk to first in this day? What if I go talk to God first? To make my life right with God, to make sure God, I'm thinking about you, you're on my mind, and I'm going to go forward today, like we talked about in a prayer class, with the idea of living with a circumspect idea of serving you in all that I do. What if we started our day like that? Maybe that would help. I'm not giving him the first day of the week. Of course, we're here, so I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but the first day of every week. Because what happens a lot of times, well, something else came up. It'll be okay. Sunday will come again next week. We'll just do it again, and it's fine. I can do this. Or maybe I'm just not feeling quite. I'm at 85% today, and I just don't feel like I'm going to be able to give everything today. So let's just stay home today. I've got family in town. They need my attention. I'll come back next week. It's fine. We talked about in the prayer class the idea of putting something on your calendar that is non-negotiable. This is what I'm going to do at this time. And that's hard to do. That's what the first day of the week needs to be for us. This is God's day. And this day needs to be devoted to him above all else. It is amazing what change it will make in our lives when I say that there is the first words of the day and the first day of the week are non-negotiably God's. Everybody else is going to have to plan around that. I don't care who they are. It doesn't matter. Parents, children, brothers and sisters, workers, co-workers, employers, government, doesn't matter. You come second. God gets this day. Thirdly, the first fruits of our labors. And you can, whether you want to talk about this in terms of contribution, I think that's valid. But I don't think that's really what I would say about this is what that means that whatever I'm doing, how much of it I'm doing, am I using, how much of my resources and my time and my labor are being directed towards serving God? And am I giving him my best of what I have as opposed to what I have left over? I'd really love to go serve God today, but you know what? I'm just tired from work. I just don't have the energy today. I'm just not going to be able to get it done. Do we give God our leftovers? Or we say, we're going to make sure that we serve God. We're going to do something for God this week or this day. And again, everything else is going to have to plan around that. And finally, the last one, this is the one I added at the end. The first thoughts in our mind. We talked about what it means to walk circumspectly. To take every step with the idea, first of all, how is this going to impact my relationship with God? Is this something God would approve of? Is this going to bring me closer to God? Or is it going to bring me farther away from God? Or does it have nothing to do with God? In the grand scheme, how is this going to affect my life? How many decisions do we make every day? And we never stop to think at all. How does this affect my life spiritually? Sometimes it's because, well, I'm just picking what I'm going to eat. It's not that big a deal, and that's probably true. But how much more spiritually minded would I be if I did at least just give a thought to that? How did God bless me today? This came from God. I'm thinking about God when I eat, when I get up, when I go to work, when I go home, when I sit down in front of the television, when I do whatever it is. What am I thinking about? Is God still there? Because he's still supposed to be on the throne reigning. And like I said, nobody reigns in my heart unless I allow it. Calvinism notwithstanding. And sometimes I don't allow God to reign simply because I stay so long out of the throne room that at some point God's just going to leave. Because that can happen too. But those are our challenges. And we think about the Ten Commandments as being negative things and no other God sounds awfully negative, but this is an invitation to us that you have a God and you don't need anything else because our God will supply our every good. Well, lesson is yours this morning. Thank you for your attention and your patience. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, please let us know what we can do for you while we stand as we're led in our invitation song.